Our top story. It's been over 200 days since the war began in Ukraine. Recently, Russia escalated its offensive, enough to call alarm bells ringing globally. In fact, Moscow has been firing a barrage of missiles on Ukrainian towns and cities practically every day for the last few days. Ukrainian troops are countering the Russian offensive and have successfully reclaimed towns captured by Moscow. But today, in a surprise development, Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has so far been upping the ante, appeared to be toning down the rhetoric over the war. Putin said there is no need for new massive strikes on Ukraine and that Russia is not looking to destroy Ukraine.
For now, there is no need for massive strikes. There are other goals to achieve for now. Out of, I think, 29 objectives, 7 have not been hit the way the Defense Ministry planned. They are dealing with them. With these objectives, there is no need for massive strikes, at least for the moment, for now. As for the future, we'll see. We do not set ourselves the task of destroying Ukraine. No, of course not.
Putin was addressing a press conference at the end of a summit in Kazakhstan. He repeated the Kremlin's position of holding talks with Ukraine. However, he said the two sides would require international mediation if Ukraine was willing to participate. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has ruled out talking to President Putin, even labeling him a terrorist. This after Russia proclaimed the annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions last month and rained missiles on Ukrainian cities this week in the wake of an attack on a vital bridge between Russia and annexed Crimea. And that's not all that Putin said today. The Russian president also stated that there are no plans for a further military mobilization in Russia.
First of all, in the beginning, the Ministry of Defense supposed to draft a lower number, not 300,000. Firstly. Secondly, nothing additional is planned. There was no suggestion on the part of the defense minister on this. And I see no need for this in the near future.
However, Putin maintains his position on the Ukraine war, saying Russia is carrying out its mission to invade Ukraine correctly. He added Moscow had a firm grip on the humanitarian Ukraine green corridors.
If humanitarian corridors for grain supply to the poorest countries, even when it's not going there, this was an excuse for the whole work. If these humanitarian corridors emerge to be used for terrorist attacks, it would call into question further existence of such corridor.
These statements by Putin could possibly change the course of the Ukraine war. First, Putin taking a step back days after what has been described as one of the biggest airstrikes by Russia. Proves that the escalation or counter-offensive by Ukrainian forces have provided a solid ground to Kiev at the negotiation table if talks are held anytime soon. Second, Russia ordering a halt on military mobilization offers a glimpse into how Putin is acknowledging the pressure back home against the mobilization given the unprecedented protests across Russia. And it's not just in Russia. Putin himself has admitted that Moscow's former Soviet allies are worried about the conflict in Ukraine. On the ground, Russia seems to be losing its annexed regions. The Russian forces have suffered a string of embarrassing battlefield defeats in recent weeks. Russian-installed officials in the annexed regions are asking citizens there to evacuate. Russia is trying to avoid a serious conflict with NATO. Maybe this is an opportunity for Ukraine to gain ground not just on the battlefield, but in the diplomatic arena as well. For more on this, we're now joined by William Courtney. He's an adjunct senior fellow with the RAND Global think tank in Washington, D.C. Mr. Courtney, thanks very much for speaking to WION.
You're welcome.
What explains this apparent climb down by Putin? He says there is no need for further major airstrikes on Ukraine. Russia does not want to destroy Ukraine, and that Moscow is willing to talk to Ukraine if Kiev is open to international mediation. Is this a Putin who suddenly turned into a peace-loving dove, or is he seriously nervous about the reverses that Russia is facing in this war?
Well, you're quite correct to describe this as a climb down. He is, in fact, nervous. He's been under a lot of pressure at home, especially by mobilization, which has led hundreds of thousands of young people to leave Russia to escape it. But it's also turning the Russian people down against the war. Before mobilization, many Russians didn't really pay much attention to the war. Now that's changed completely. Some body bags of people who were mobilized only a few weeks ago are now beginning to come back to Russian households. So that's a key issue. Then the United Nations recently condemned Russia's aggression. Only 4 countries voted with Russia in that, and 153, I believe, voted to condemn Russia. The economic sanctions are beginning to bite. The auto industry in Russia has taken a huge hit from those sanctions, and then the military setbacks in Ukraine itself. So it's the combination of all these things together that is really forcing Russia to pay closer attention to the amount of pressures and what the Russians call the correlation of forces. It's really moved against Russia dramatically in the last couple of months.
Putin may be a nervous man at the moment, even if he's not going to admit it. Mr. Courtney, we know you need to leave. One quick question before we let you go. Now, Putin significantly has also halted the controversial military mobilization that he had announced, which saw thousands of Russian men trying to flee that country. Does Putin believe that move backfired in a big way back home? Also, is he finally trying to de-escalate tensions with NATO, which has been talking about imposing further crippling costs on Moscow?
I think you're correct about the first explanation. It's become so unpopular at home. It is reminiscent of a pension reform that the authorities in the Kremlin unveiled in 2018, which called forth protests in probably 100 or so Russian cities. It was a measure that the Kremlin hadn't planned very carefully and became extremely unpopular. Mobilization is like that, except it's even more unpopular.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Mr. Courtney, thanks very much for sharing your perspective with WION.
You're quite welcome.